Hello and welcome to World Today here on TVP World. My name is Ashim Kumar. Since 2015, Ukraine has marked the Day of Remembrance and Reconciliation on the 8th of May. This date was changed from the 9th of May. The event honours the memory of all the victims of World War II, which occurred, of course, between 1939 and 1945. Russia, on the other hand, clings to celebrating Victory Day on May the 9th to acknowledge the defeat of Hitler's Nazi Germany. Ironically, there are some interesting parallels between these two former enemies. Modern Russia is destroying the international order that has prevailed since World War II, behaving not as a guarantor of security in the UN Security Council, but emulating the Nazi ideology of destruction of international relations, perhaps dragging the world into a new Cold War. To discuss Russia's ambitions, I'm joined by Alexei Goncharenko, he's Ukrainian Member of Parliament, and Bogdan Nahailo, he's the chief editor of the Kyiv Post. Gentlemen, welcome. But before we get into our conversation, there's a short video that I'd like to share with our audience.
And between them,
on May 8, 1945, German troops finally surrendered, ending the war in Europe. More than 5 years of war resulted in millions of casualties and unprecedented destruction. Post-war Europe was divided in half between independent Western nations and a group of Soviet-controlled satellite states in the east. The fear of the destruction another continent-wide war would bring ensured that no wider conflict took place in the next 45 years. With the collapse of the Soviet bloc, many former Soviet states and satellites joined the Western institutions of EU and NATO. This guaranteed their protection from external threats. Some, like Ukraine, remain outside of the system. Now, the country is experiencing war once again.
But the commemoration of victory in the Second World War also brings with it a very painful historical paradox. A country whose name was borne by the main forces involved in the liberation of Czechoslovakia, the 1st, 2nd and 4th Ukrainian Corps, is now itself the object of aggression by one of the victorious powers of the time, Russia. And the conflict in Ukraine is very reminiscent of the battlefields of the Second World War in its scale and its degree of destruction.
After the Russian invasion began, Kyiv expressed clear intention to join the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Ukrainians hope that the full inclusion in the Western security system will protect them from aggression in the future.
Alexei, I'll start with you. I noticed you nodding your head as you were watching that video. Is this simply, if I can use that word, a conflict between democracy and imperialism, or is there something deeper here?
It's a lot of here. It's definitely Ukrainian war for independence, and Russia is acting as a colonial empire, the last colonial empire in Europe. So this is imperialistic war. Colonial war of Russia against Ukraine. At the same time, it's the war of democracy against autocracies, because Russia is like a country with a autocratic regime or dictatorship, and they are showing how other dictatorships look at the world as the stage for fulfilling all their wishes. And they don't believe in democracy, they are afraid of democracy. And that's why they are attacking democratic states. So it's also here. At the same time, Russia is, and we acknowledged it in the parliament by adopting special resolution, we called it Russism, the ideology of Russia. It's today's new version of Nazism, because all of these, Russia is really, like in many things, is copying Nazi Germany. So altogether, that's all in one place in this war of Russia against Ukraine.
Well, you mentioned, Alexei, that there are many similarities in the strategies between Russia and Nazi Germany. Bogdan, if I can bring you into the conversation here, one example is when Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, using the excuse of German citizens who lived there. We see something very similar, of course, with the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine. What, in your opinion, Bogdan, is Putin's end game here?
Putin's end game, like Hitler, is the idea of a greater Russia, a greater Reich. In the name, the excuse is, to spread the German world, read Russian world, beyond the borders of Germany and colonize other areas like Ukraine and elsewhere. But look, your example is good about Czechoslovakia. But really, Hitler started with the Sudetendeutsch. It's 1938, the dismemberment of Poland, of Czechoslovakia, was in the name of defending German speakers, right? The Sudetendeutsch, exactly the same tactics. The Anschluss with Austria, same tactic. Now we have not only the Donbass supposedly, but even Zaporizhia and other regions wanting theoretically, but by force imposed, voting to become part of Russia, as Crimea did not so long ago under the enforced regulations of Russia. So exactly the same sort of tactics. But I think the most important thing to remember on VE Day is the war that was won by democracy in the West in 1945 was begun by Nazi Germany together with Russian-dominated Soviet Union in 1939 when they attacked Poland. And it was this attack on Poland that mobilized the West, Britain, France, and others. America wasn't in the war then. And even to this day, in the former Soviet Union area that has remained loyal to Russia, World War II is not regarded as starting in 1939, the attack on Poland, but with 1941, when an ally attacked Russia, read Soviet Union. So look, history is repeating itself, and the revisionism that Putin represents with respect to Ukrainian history is a revisionism that challenges European and general, sort of democratic, objective, historical treatments of the past.
Well, you put that very clearly, Bogdan, and we see here it's the use of information, or if you like, disinformation, to mold public opinion and justify Putin's actions, similar to what Goebbels did, and Hitler was very good at doing too, during the Second World War. Alexei, what is Putin's message to the people that makes it so believable to the Russian people?
Because they want to believe in this. The problem is not that Putin's message is so strong. The problem is that Russian people really want to believe in this. They have this imperialism in their heads. They have this revanchism in their heads. And they're exactly the same, which was in Germany in the beginning of 1930s. And only after Germany came through denazification, read de-imperialization, only after this Germany could become a really great nation and great country with prosperous, with human rights, good neighbor, and so on and so on. But before this de-imperialization, they were so dangerous. The same with Russia. But the problem is that Russia never came through de-imperialization. And that is something which should happen in future. And I think that it will happen quite soon. I hope and I believe that this war against Ukraine will be the last war of this empire, of Russian Empire. And after this, Russian people will come through this denazification. I think that will change the borders of Russian Federation significantly. But the main thing that it will change the minds of Russian people, because without this, they will find new Putin and they will do exactly the same again. Again, today, the problem is not in Putin himself. The problem is in Russian imperialism, in which millions of Russians really believe in.
But some might argue that the German people under Hitler in the mid-30s, 1930s, when he actually took power, were moved to follow Hitler because of dire economic circumstances and so on. However, there is a distinction, some suggest, in Russia / the Soviet Union, in that even during the times of the Tsar, the running of the country, the entry into wars and so on, was simply delegated without question to those in power, whether it's the Tsar or whether it was the communist government. Bogdan, would you agree with that analysis?
I would certainly agree with that. Look, Russian imperialism has a long, long history. Why did the British join with their former enemies from Napoleonic times, the French, to fight in Crimea in the 1850s? You know, because Russia presented a great threat to Europe, the Dardanelles, to India eventually, etc. And we're seeing the same. Isn't it ironic that the Dardanelles, the Black Sea, is again a center of this East-West confrontation? But let's, I think Alexei puts his finger on it. Russian imperialism is deep-rooted. It's not a question of just Putin. It goes back to the Tsars. Remember, and I'm sure there are many Poles listening to this, but not only, Ukraine of today, it was represented by Poland in the 19th century. Poland was the big, sort of bone in Russian imperialism's throat. And Imperial Russia didn't want Poland to go westward. It wanted to maintain it. Why did the Poles have so many insurrections in the 19th century? Because they wanted freedom. And Ukraine today is in the role, if you want, in the 21st century of Poland in the 19th century. Times have changed. We've moved on to a democratic world, to a supposedly post-Cold War, post-Soviet world. And yet Russia, through Putin and his ideological gurus, are playing on this residual imperialism that's in the DNA of the Russian people, and this sense of hurt that the Soviet Union collapsed just as Germany was defeated in 1918, and this was somehow not fair to Russia. But listen, they don't look at the other aspects. What do the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, and the others think about this, let alone what the Ukrainians, their neighbors, the Georgians, the Moldavans think about this? So, at the end of the day, history is being revisited, and though we've made a lot of progress in many areas, in Russia they're still very backward ideologically, culturally, not in the sense of ballet, in the sense of the pokazuchas, the Potemkin culture, but in terms of their own political culture and mindsets.
Right. So mindsets, DNA of the Russian population. Alexei, would you agree with that? And if you do, would you also agree that it'd be extremely difficult to change, certainly in fewer than 2 or perhaps even more generations?
No, I think that Germany showed that it is absolutely possible. Definitely the process of denazification was very hard, and it took time, and some generations were probably still very much imperialized, but it happened. So it can happen, but for Germany, the way to happen this denazification was German defeat, complete defeat and capitulation. For the moment, Russia did not come to this end, but it's something they should come in just for the benefit of themselves, of Russians, because who will benefit more that they will stop to be just a cannon fodder for a new dictator than Russians? But that is their problem. For us, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, other countries, that is so important that when this empire is still alive, it's a complete threat and eternal threat till it exists. And that's something which unites us today, because Polish people clearly understand, like Latvians and Lithuanians, they clearly understand that if Russia will survive this war, sooner or later they will attack again. So our objective is to finish with this empire finally, and that's the only way for us to live in security in our countries.
So the only way out, Bogdan, is a complete dismantling, an ending of Putin's or the Soviet Empire, if you like. Otherwise, there's simply no peace for surrounding countries. Would you agree?
I agree, but we hope that there will be enough Russians within Russia that will effect either a palace coup, get rid of Caligula, the Praetorian Guard around Putin, and rethink, what is the damage that has been done, the economic, the isolation, the loss of prestige, the loss of allies, the prospect of becoming a Chinese vassal in 10 or 15 years' time, the loss of huge markets, energy markets in the West, for example. Any reasonably thinking person would already reflect on this. And I'm hoping that even though there seem to be very few Democrats in Russia active, because those that are imprisoned or have fled the country, that the younger generation will not buy into this cheap imperialist populism. And our only hope is that military defeat, as happened with Russia in 1905, in the 1850s, in the Crimean War, will produce results in the changes of the mindset. But most importantly is that with Ukraine's victory, Ukraine has to be integrated into the EU and NATO, and the border of Eurasia and Europe has to be at the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. And I just want to mention that Alexei's done a really good job in Parliament. He's one of the MPs that is also mentioning Belarus. Belarus is also a factor here. Yes, Lukashenko, the dictator, is there. There is 1,500 political prisoners or whatever. But the population doesn't want to be part of Russia. As soon as Ukraine is victorious, I'm sure that the majority of the population, having suffered such repressions in the last 3 or 4 years, will turn westward. And that's Europe. We have to reconfigure Europe along democratic values and to build that family of European nations afresh.
So a reconfiguration of Europe, Alexei, is what Bogdan is proposing and suggesting that it's inevitable. And I would suggest that probably makes some kind of sense. But here's the question. Is there a risk that actually a Russian defeat would result in some feeling of, hard done by the Russian people, thereby, making it a thorn in the side of Russian society, in the same way that happened to German society between World War I and World War II?
I hope that analogy will be different, and that's what happened with the German society between World War I and World War II. That looks very similar with what had happened with Russian society. Is Putin's attempt to rebuild Russian empire again. So I hope this will be an analogy, and I hope that this time Russian complete military defeat will lead to disintegration of Russian empire and to denazification and de-imperialization of Russia completely. That is my hope. Because that's the only way to have security in this part of the world, and even in general in the world, because Russia is a nuclear state. By the way, I think that it should be followed by denuclearization of Russia, because we can't leave nuclear weaponry in the hands of a nation which uses it as a threat. And the whole idea of the nuclear club was never ever use it or never ever blackmail with it. That's exactly what Russia is doing constantly. And that's something which we should do. And I hope that we will have this possibility, this historical moment. That will be our window of opportunity. The West did not use it in 1991, but I think that we need to make lessons from the mistakes made that time. And this time we should fix these mistakes. And we should deal with Russia exactly the same way like the free world did with Nazi Germany after 1945.
Right. So what did the free world do with Nazi Germany? There were war crimes trials and there were reparations paid by Germany to countries where it had caused destruction. I know Poland is still claiming some reparations and those talks are underway. But do you feel that Russia owes an obligation to pay reparations to Ukraine and perhaps other countries that it may have affected? And if so, Bogdan, where from? Should Russian wealth outside Russia be used for this purpose?
Certainly, Russia is responsible for war crimes, damage, huge damage to infrastructure, depopulation of entire regions, destruction of cities. Look at Mariupol, look what's happening in the Bakhmut area, etc. Who is supposed to pay the bill? Is it reasonable for Ukraine to ask its Western allies to foot the bill? No, the culprit has to pay for that. But remember, the arrangement after World War II, yes, the Germans paid reparations after World War I, and they did pay reparations after World War II. But the Germans were subsidized by the Marshall Plan. It wouldn't have been possible without the Marshall Plan being there. Ukraine needs a huge Marshall Plan because we know billions will be needed for the recovery and restoration of Ukraine. And there has to be a certain amount of conditionality imposed on Russia. Russia has to be defeated, not only militarily, but as I've said, their mindset. They have to be persuaded through, let's say, positive propaganda. Let's call it propaganda, but the Russian public has to be shown what they're not being shown on their TV and radios, the banned internet. They have to be exposed. Remember what the Germans were exposed to? They had to go to cinemas and watch, the bodies of Jews being exhumated, the camps being opened. Russians don't have this. They feel that they are the victims. They are being told that the Ukrainians are the killers, the Nazis. We have to rectify this in many respects and then demand from the Russians also that their natural wealth, what remains of their oil, if the Chinese don't take it or the Indians, that they pay from that. Of course, that's only reasonable.
Well, that certainly seems logical. Let's hope that is what comes to pass. Bogdan and Alexei, thank you both very much for taking the time to join us this evening, and do stay safe. Good evening. And that's all from us here tonight on World Today. Don't go away, lots more coming up. Goodbye for now.